Hello everyone, I'm Kelly from 1-800-RESPECT and welcome to today's webinar. Before we start, I would like to pay our respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this meeting takes place and also pay respect to elders, both past and present. Today's topic is forced marriage, understanding context and connecting to services. Frontline workers are often best placed to recognise indicators, identify vulnerable people and link them to appropriate support services. We're pleased to welcome our presenter for today, Jennifer Byrne. Jennifer is Director, Anti-Slavery Australia and Associate Professor, UTS Faculty of Law. Anti-Slavery Australia is the only university-based law and research centre in Australia dedicated to advancing the rights of people who have experienced human trafficking and extreme forms of exploitation by providing access to legal advice and representation for trafficked and enslaved people in Australia. The law practice currently assists over 70 clients with a wide range of legal issues, including representation for those in or facing forced marriage, migration matters, or housing and other issues. Jennifer Byrne is a member of the National Roundtable on Human Trafficking and Slavery, a frequent media commentator, and a practicing lawyer and migration agent. Please note this webinar is live and interactive. You're encouraged to participate by posing questions to Jennifer, which can be typed into the chat box, which is located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. There'll be approximately 10 minutes at the end of the webinar for question and answer time. Jennifer will attempt to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. And should your question not be answered during the webinar, Jennifer is happy to be contacted via email afterwards at jennifer.byrne@uts.edu.au. If you're experiencing any difficulty hearing the sound during the webinar, please dial the 1-800 support number listed in the chat box. I'm now very pleased to pass over to Jennifer to begin today's webinar.
Thank you, Kelly. It's terrific to be here with you all to discuss this important and emerging issue of forced marriage in Australia. And we're going to go straight to the slides. Thank you. I'd like to begin by firstly speaking a bit about the work of Anti-Slavery Australia and explain why an organisation like us is involved in this space. One of the first things to note is that best practice responses to forced marriage are still developing, and there are a number of key organisations involved in developing these responses. And we'd like to involve as many organisations as possible in this discussion. I'd like to begin by remembering to change the slide. Sorry. To speak about the context of forced marriage in Australia, to speak about forced marriage law, the criminalisation of forced marriage as an offence, and to talk about some of the indicators of forced marriage and the effect of forced marriage on survivors. Our task, I think, is to develop best practice responses to forced marriage, and this is part of an emerging discussion. So the organisations that are involved in this discussion, include 1-800-RESPECT, the Australian Red Cross, the Australian Human Rights Commission, Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, Salvation Army, Legal Aid, Community Law Centres, as well as the Australian Government and state and territory governments. Importantly, in New South Wales and Victoria, the Red Cross and Anti-Slavery Australia have convened with communities forced marriage networks, and we'd encourage you to connect with these networks if you'd like to continue your participation in developing best practice responses to forced marriage in Australia. This is just locating within a table Anti-Slavery Australia's approach to this issue, and at the very centre of this table you'll see that we have research and advocacy. We are based in a university and we do prioritise evidence-based, developing a strong response based on research and evidence. And that's why we draw on research that's been produced by academics, by the Australian Institute of Criminology and other organisations to frame and develop this response. We've learned a lot by observing and reading about international best practice, particularly in the UK, which has had a long involvement in developing responses to forced marriage. But our task and our collective task is to think about the human rights and the needs of the person affected by forced marriage and to put them at the centre of any response that's developed to either prevent forced marriage or to provide support and protection to survivors. I'd like now to make a couple of comments about forced marriage within the international and the Australian context, and begin by referring to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says quite clearly that marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of the intending spouses. And this is an absolutely critical and fundamental human right, and a right that's echoed in multiple international conventions and treaties, and which has been adopted completely into Australian law. Many of us, such as Anti-Slavery Australia, have an involvement with the Australian Government National Roundtable on Human Trafficking and Slavery, and through that body there is a collaborative effort to address slavery and slavery-like practices. And that's why an organisation like Anti-Slavery Australia is involved in this area, because in international law, forced marriage is considered to be such a serious violation of human rights and a crime against the person that it is a slavery-like practice. So forced marriage is a crime in Australia. It is considered to be an abuse, a form of exploitation that is so severe that it is a slavery-like practice. This principle of human rights and respect for those in or at risk of forced marriage is absolutely critical and has been central in the development of the Australian Government National Action Plan to respond to slavery-like practices, including forced marriage. Let's just look at the scope of forced marriage in the international context. And internationally and in Australia, it can be difficult to estimate the numbers of people who are affected by the practice of forced marriage. But in a major report produced by Plan International, that organisation estimated that 14 million girls under the age of 18 are married each year around the world. Observing that statistic and also reflecting on the academic literature and anecdotal experience, it is clear that while most reported victims are young women and girls, also affect boys and men, and that's certainly been the case in Australia too. Forced marriage can be an issue for members of the lesbian gay community and for those members of the Australian community who have a disability. So the framing of forced marriage in the Australian context is that it is a slavery-like practice. It is a severe violation of human rights, of humanity, and most recently we've seen credible reports of forced marriage as a form of violence against women and girls in crisis situations and in civil war. And these are the reports that we're seeing almost daily through media. Well, what's happening in Australia. Firstly, we don't have many statistics about the Australian about the demographic affected in Australia. But the AFP have reported that since forced marriage became a crime, there's been 49 referrals to the Australian Federal Police for forced marriage offences, and of that 49, the AFP are continuing to investigate 41, and the majority in this context are children under the age of 18. There are a number of cases in the family law jurisdiction that really highlight something of the pattern of forced marriage in Australia, and I'll just refer to some of those cases now. You'll be able to see a slide in front of you, and there are case names listed there. I'd like to note that these case names are not real names. They're just names that have been decided by the court. But just to mention one or two of these cases to illustrate something about the pattern of forced marriage in Australia. In the first case, Essie and Elia, this involved a report of a young girl of 14 who underwent a non-legally sanctioned marriage ceremony. So that is a marriage that took place outside the requirements of the Marriage Act of Australia. She was, she explained, pushed to get married and really deceived about what marriage meant. But disturbingly, at this time, she did tell a teacher at her school that there was a marriage pending, and there wasn't a response from the school. But I should make it clear, information about this case really come to light, and that school teacher would have received that information about 8 years ago. The response now from the school and from the school community, I believe, would be different. Disturbingly, after the marriage, her education, but she told the court her husband stopped her from going to school. He burned her homework and forced her to leave school. If you don't drop out, I'll move you so far away that you won't ever see people. The case of Human Services and Vulcana also involved a 14-year-old girl who was anticipating going overseas to marry her 17-year-old fiancé. I should make it clear that in all these cases on the screen that you can see, those affected are Australian citizens. So in this case of Human Services in Vulcana, she was a 14-year-old girl. She stopped going to school. In this case, school teachers referred her matter to Victorian Child Protection Services, who investigated, and there was an application to the court. And the court said that she, as a child, would not understand the significance of marriage, and the court issued an injunction to prevent her from going overseas. In the case of Crete and Sampere, this involved a marriage that did take place in an overseas country, and in that case the court decided to void the marriage, or in other words to cancel or to annul the marriage, because the woman in this case did not form a full and free consent, because the will to consent to the marriage had been overborne through the effects of coercion. The case of Nagri and Chappell involves the case of a man who was also subject to a forced marriage in Australia. In this case, the coercion that was exerted upon him that took away his free will was coercion involving financial pressure and financial stress. And in that case, the court also agreed that he had been, in effect, subject to forced marriage. Now, these cases took place before forced marriage became a criminal offence in Australia, but they do highlight something about the pattern of forced marriage in Australia. I'd like to say quite clearly that reports of forced marriage are absolutely not limited to any particular group, any particular ethnic, religious or cultural group. Our reports have been elucidated from many different communities, and that's the experience in the UK as well. It's also important to say that the best framing, we think, in responding to forced marriage is to recognise that it is most often a form of violence against women and girls. It is a form of gender-based violence that takes place often within families. So in very many ways, best practice responses in this area is really in line with best practice responses to family violence and family violence within families and against girls and women. But in looking at the responses, it's really important that we do think about the evidence and make any comment based on what is known. There can be some misunderstandings about forced marriage in the broader community, and there are certainly misunderstandings in the media. And the media reports on this issue are sensationalist and alarming and inaccurate and just have the effect of stigmatising communities. In March 2013, the Australian government passed legislation that made forced marriage in Australia a crime. The offence of forced marriage was drafted after a lot of community consultation and in response to a discussion paper that had been produced by the Australian Attorney General's Department. In responding to the issue of whether or not a criminal response is the most desirable response, perhaps it could be argued that there are other responses that would be more suitable, given that this form of violence is something that occurs within families, the sensitive framing of family structures, gender violence, references to patriarchal communities and community expectations, that perhaps criminalisation wasn't the best response, some commentators argued. Anti-Slavery Australia supported the introduction of an offence, but in consort and in collaboration with communities, so that the criminalisation would be one part of an effective response that would also include, meaningful consultation with communities, respect for initiatives that develop out of communities to ensure that the human rights of people in or facing forced marriage are fully respected. But the Australian law, the offence of forced marriage in the Australian law, in the Commonwealth Criminal Code, says that it is an offence to cause a person to enter into a forced marriage or to be a party to a forced marriage. And a party to a forced marriage means agreeing to marry somebody that you know or suspect is a victim of forced marriage, unless you are also the victim yourself. There are very serious offences, penalties associated with forced marriage, and you can see that there is 4 years or 7 years imprisonment, which is part of the current law if an offence is proved in a criminal court, and sometimes those offences and the penalties can be greater if the victim of the forced marriage is a child. There is a proposal to expand the definition of forced marriage to make it clear that there will be a criminal offence of forced marriage if a person under the age of 16 marries without the opportunity to address the presumption that they haven't consented. I'll just say that in another way. the proposal to amend the law is that it's assumed that children under the age of 16 cannot consent to the marriage, but they can present evidence to the court that shows that they did have the capacity to fully and freely consent. So this is what's called a rebuttable presumption. And there's also a proposal before the Australian Parliament to increase the offences of forced marriage to 7 years and 9 years for the aggravated offence. And the aggravated offence is the offence that would include forced marriage of a child, for example. Now, this is relevant because the forced marriage offences apply to a range of marriages, including those that take place under the Marriage Act of Australia, and I'll come back to that in a moment. They do cover marriages that are not legally sanctioned marriage ceremonies. So this is it. A forced marriage is a marriage entered into without the full and free consent of one or both of the people affected as a result of coercion, threat or deception. And this applies to legally recognised marriages as well as cultural or religious ceremonies and registered relationships. It applies regardless of the age, gender or sexual orientation of a victim. Let's just have a look at what is meant by coercion, threats and deception. Now, coercion in everyday language means putting some kind of pressure on a person so that they feel they have no choice but to get married. Now, in legal language, this is sometimes referred to as, the will is overborne. They don't have the capacity to form a full and free consent because of some kind of pressure that's been put on them. There's been a development of the law over the years, and it's absolutely clear that the pressure can include non-violent pressure, such as very controlling coercion on the part of parents, perhaps. And in the court, this is a subjective test, so it's what the actual victim or the survivor would explain about the impact of coercion. Threats would include physical violence that's actually inflicted on a person, such as being hit or falsely imprisoned, or the threats of violence. And deception includes tricking a person about the nature of the marriage or what the marriage ceremony is. So within the Australian context, forced marriages apply to marriages that take place in Australia, that take place outside Australia, if the conduct that leads to the forced marriage is by an Australian citizen or resident. And the forced marriage offences apply to legally recognised marriages, that's marriages enacted in accordance with the Marriage Act, as well as cultural or religious ceremonies and registered relationships. And the offences would involve or would include victims regardless of their age, gender or sexual orientation. Now, it's important to always distinguish between arranged marriages and sham marriages. Arranged marriages are completely legal in the Australian context. It's legal around the world. And they're quite simply marriages that are really arranged or organised through family connections. So it could be parents who are introducing children to each other in the hope that they may form a connection and decide to marry. It could be friends introducing couples to each other because they think they might like each other and might eventually marry. It is just a marriage that's organised through some kind of connection. It's absolutely fundamental, though, that the choice lies with the man and the woman affected, so that they do have the ability to decline the marriage or to accept it. So a marriage must be entered into with the full and free consent by both of the parties. And if the marriage is arranged and if they both agree fully and freely, then that's absolutely fine and completely legal. Sometimes marriages are sham marriages, and these are not usually considered forced marriages, but they are where there is some kind of fake claim that a marriage is genuine for a benefit, and often for migration benefits, in which case one party says, I'm going to pay you X amount of money to marry me, pretend we're in a genuine relationship, you'll get the money and I'll get the visa. That's a sham marriage. It's a fraudulent claim of a genuine relationship for a benefit. Sometimes there might be an interconnection between a forced marriage and a sham marriage, and this could take place where a marriage has been organised by traffickers, where there is an intention to exploit one of the parties. And there's been some research by the Australian Institute of Criminology that says that this could be an issue in some cases involving partner migration. And one of the cases that went to court in Australia that did involve slavery offences did have an element of a sham marriage as one of the aspects of that marriage. It's also important to distinguish between forced marriage, arranged marriage, sham marriage and servile marriage. And it's just a terminology issue, but servile marriage has a very particular and very limited meaning. And it really just refers to cases that would fall within a 1956 slavery convention, where a woman is treated as a piece of property, where she doesn't have the right to refuse a marriage, or where she's been inherited by somebody or given to somebody. This is a very limited form of marriage, although it could take place in Australia. Sometimes we use the phrase servile marriage to refer more generally to situations where people in Australia are exploited in a labour context. But within the Australian criminal framework, such exploitation might be slavery or servitude or forced labour, but we don't have a specific offence of forced marriage. I wanted to speak very briefly about some of the stories that go to illustrate coercion, and these come from the UK context. I spoke about some Australian cases earlier that went to court, but these are examples from the UK that do indicate the subtlety of coercion. So in the first case of Narina, she explains that she was isolated. She was caught between her feelings and the community's expectations. She felt she would dishonour her family if she didn't go ahead with the marriage. And in Sola's case, she says that she was isolated. She had a disability because she was deaf, and she also didn't have the ability to fully and freely consent to the marriage. In Australian law, the Marriage Act says that marriageable age is 18. In some cases, children aged 16 and 17 can marry if the court and the children's parents agrees, and if only one of the couples under 18. And of course, there are also child protection legislation in each of the states and territories. Just thinking about some of the warning signs and indicators of forced marriage, I think that when you look at this list, you'll think that these kinds of indicators could apply to many forms of harm, or they really are alerts that could indicate many forms or many issues that could raise concerns about a child's well-being or a person's or an adult's well-being. So in the context of children, perhaps they're not going to school, there's been a change in their school performance, there might be health issues. importantly, within the family, within the forced marriage literature, we see that if there's been a sibling in the family who's been forced to marry, that can be a very powerful indicator that there may be a forced marriage that could explain, that could raise a warning that there might be risk of forced marriage. And these other kinds of indicators might also be present. So I guess the message would be for all of us who work with those who are vulnerable, children and adults, that where there are warning signs and indicators that indicate that well-being isn't optimal, that forced marriage may be, one of the range of harms that might be considered. The effects of forced marriage are really very serious, and you can see here that forced marriage is a slavery-like practice, and these consequences that are listed here on this slide, also apply to any person who's been in a situation of slavery or servitude in Australia. So a person who is experiencing forced marriage is severely impacted. Their human rights are affected. They really do have a need for support and for a lot of support so that they can respond themselves within a good human rights framework. So what I'd like to talk about a bit now is some of the framework that's developed, and to say again what I said at the beginning, which is that the best practice response to forced marriage in the Australian context is still developing. We want you to get involved in forging this response, and one way you can do that is to connect with organisations who are working in this space. And one of those networks is the Forced Marriage Network in New South Wales and Victoria. The Red Cross is convening the Victorian network, and Anti-Slavery and Red Cross convene the New South Wales network. Now, although these are convened by these organisations, the terms of reference and the structure for the Forced Marriage Network is based on grassroots organisation and is participatory. So each of the Forced Marriage Networks has working groups addressing prevention, direct services, best practice and education, and these are groups that are located in communities, and these initiatives are developed out of communities. So try and connect with the Forced Marriage Networks if you can. Find out more information by contacting Anti-Slavery Australia or the Red Cross, or by emailing me. So the key is collaborative departments, partnerships, working properly with communities. This is not and should not ever be a top-down approach. It's to really respectfully engage with a whole range of communities so that organisations can work out what is the best prevention strategy and response in their community. And in designing these responses, we are looking at best practice and doing, designing a response that is completely respectful of the needs of survivors, that does respect the vulnerability of survivors and does provide really sustained and effective support. Now, collaboration is the key. There are other resources that are available. One of those is the Australian Attorney General's Department Forced Marriage Community Pack, and there's information on this slide about how you can access that pack. This was a collaborative exercise. We were on the working party that developed this material, and all the other organisations that I've mentioned were also parties here. So this is a useful resource, and one that I'd encourage you to have a look at. So thinking about referral pathways, this is a work in progress. I think that we recognise that those who are at risk or in a forced marriage have multiple needs, including housing, money, medical help, legal needs, education and counselling. Clearly, you are all, I've seen that, just a description that many of you who are participating in this seminar today are involved in community responses, in the health sector, community sector, and in the legal sector. And you're also based across Australia. You would be familiar with the mandatory reporting requirements in your state. Of course, across Australia, if we're ever fearful that there is an emergency, that a person is at risk of harm, 000 is the first response. The Australian Federal Police does have a human trafficking team that is specialising in slavery and slavery-like offences, including forced marriage, and you can contact them. You could also contact 1800-RESPECT. Anti-Slavery Australia can be contacted too, and we'd encourage that contact with you. In thinking about developing standards that operate across the sector, one of the initiatives that we worked on through the National Roundtable was to develop guidelines for NGOs working with trafficked people. And these were kind of intended to be a set of overriding principles. All of us have different professional frameworks. We're community workers, counsellors, psychologists, lawyers. We all have professional responsibilities. But these NGO guidelines were intended to distill the elements of professional practice that cut across all of our areas of professional practice. So it's worth having a look at these guidelines. They are in the process of being updated, and I would expect the 2015 version will be available within weeks. But do have a look at these, and the 2015 version will have some material on forced marriage included. Now, we have also got material of Anti-Slavery Australia, and you can contact us if you would like multilingual material. And I've listed the languages that this material is available in on this slide. We also have a little fold-out leaflets that are great for school-age people, flyers and reception posters. And this is all multilingual. If you'd like to have any of this, please contact us. And we've only had the printed versions for the last few weeks, but we've sent out thousands of them already as a result of requests. We've got a very exciting initiative, which is a dedicated website on forced marriage that we'll be launching on the 25th of November this year. This will be launched on the day, or the International Day of the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And this website is called My Blue Sky, My Future. Not called Anti-Slavery Australia, it's called My Blue Sky. And this is a website that will be a national portal for information and help across Australia. It will include referral information. There will be multilingual material there, but importantly, it will be an entry point for legal advice and representation. There will be an exit button that's available on the screen that will allow a person to quickly leave the site and destroy any evidence that that site has been accessed. We are expanding this service directory now. If you'd like to be included, please let us know. Now, just have a look at the little image at the bottom of the slide. See the My Blue Sky image? That's the aesthetic that we've been working on with the designers. So, it's meant to be an optimistic, engaging site. We haven't included bars, we haven't included oppressive images. It's meant to be positive, and it will include material, that is written in a way that will, engage and inspire rather than terrify. We are in the final weeks, as you can tell, of settling this. So, if you'd like to know more about this now, please contact us. We've also got at Anti-Slavery Australia an e-learning platform. You can access this through our website, antislavery.org.au, and there is a specific module on that website that deals with forced marriage. You might be interested to have a look at that too. Now, there is an upcoming event that you might be interested in if you're in Adelaide, Melbourne or Sydney, and I've included details about that event here. Jacinda Sangara is a UK survivor of forced marriage, and she will be speaking particularly about honour violence within the context of forced marriage. So you might like to register for those events. Finally, I think that, what we're trying to do is to respond to forced marriage with a range of community partners and taking into account the needs and the opinions of survivors. This is a step-by-step process. There is not a template that is top-down. It's a process that's, honestly engaging with communities and with vulnerable people, and this is something that's developing. So if you'd like to contact us, again, we'd really love to engage with you. What I would like to do in closing is just show you a short film animation that was developed in the UK. I know that 1800 Respect is developing a poster that will be available in the Australian context, and I'm sure that there'll be more about that later, either today or through the 1800 communication pathways. But I'd like you to have a look at this short animation, and it has been helpful for us, as we've been framing our approach to developing information for community workers and for others affected. So if you'd like more information about what we do, about the legal response, or anything at all, in this area, please contact us. This has obviously been a very short overview, and I've really taken up a lot of time, and I'd love to talk more. So please do keep in touch, and I look forward to answering any questions that I can answer after you've seen this video. And thank you so much for the opportunity. Here we go.
The animation title appears in a blue sky. It reads, Your Tomorrow. A young girl is walking along a conveyor belt. Her clothes change from casual wear into a school uniform as she passes by two other girls and through the school gates. School books fall from the sky into her arms. She approaches a man and a woman standing together, her parents, and she passes them her report card. Her father pats her on the head and she dances away happily as her school uniform changes into a bright yellow dress. She passes by a young boy and they turn to face each other as they cross paths. A love heart floats above her. Another conveyor belt appears beside hers with a different boy walking along it. They stop walking and turn to face each other. His mother and father appear on either side of him, and her mother and father appear on either side of her. The boy presents her with a flower. The conveyor belt with the boy and his parents drops from the sky. The girl is confused and turns quickly to her mother and father as her yellow dress turns into a pink wedding gown. Her parents disappear and she is suddenly running towards a departure gate with luggage strewn around her. She rushes through a security checkpoint and falls at the feet of a man in a suit. The conveyor belt stops and he offers his hand to help her up, but she pulls away. Red lights are flashing off-screen and the conveyor belt starts to run rapidly in reverse, taking her back through the airport, past her luggage and back to her parents again. A rope falls from the sky. She pulls it and her wedding gown changes back into a casual dress as the conveyor belt transforms into a crossroad. She stands at the crossroads and looks in every direction but doesn't know which way to go. She turns back to face her parents and then the camera zooms in on the girl as she chooses the path that takes her towards her two girlfriends. She embraces one and the other laughs. As the camera drifts up into the sky, a message appears. Childline 0800 1111 in association with the Forced Marriage Unit. The animation ends.
I just wanted to say I can see that there's lots of questions. And I'm very happy to answer these after if we can't get to all of them now.
Okay, is the video completed?
It looks like
Yes, the video is finished.
The video is finished? Okay, so here from Tymek saying, what are the statistics about forced marriages which are not arranged marriages? Are they common?
Okay. We don't really have any clear or reliable information on how common forced marriages are in Australia. What we do have is an indication. We do have some material from the family court that speaks about case applications that have been made to the court. And we've also got the statistics from the Australian Federal Police that say that since March 2013, they've had 49 referrals for forced marriage type situations, and of those they're continuing to investigate 41. So we don't have complete information by any means in the Australian context, and research is an important element of developing a really effective response, and this is something that is ongoing and necessary.
Great. We have another question here, Jennifer, asking what are the attitudes and responses effects on the forcing side, spouses and families?
So why do families enter into a forced marriage? There are many reasons, and I think it's important when we're thinking about this, we don't demonise families and demonise communities. But the international research says that families might be concerned about a child's future. They are seeking financial security or social security for their child. They might be trying to support the child because there might be an element of disability. Sometimes there are reports, particularly from the UK research, that community expectations and perceptions of religion or community might be at play here. But there are many and diverse reasons why forced marriage may be compelled on an unwilling person.
Right, and another question, where do you get the guidelines for NGOs, Doc?
Okay, these are available on the Australian Attorney General's website, ag.gov.au. And it's that website that you can look at as well, which would give you the Attorney General's community pack about forced marriage. And that pack includes information on the safety plan. It's got information on risk factors, responses, referral information, and there's also a section of the community pack that deals with language and gives information for media. So it's definitely worth having a look at that community pack on the Attorney General's website.
Great, and I think we've got time for just one final question now, Jennifer, which is in relation to the proposed changes to the legislation, where are these changes at?
That's a really good question. And, the changes are part of a bill that deals with a whole lot of other issues. They're basically at the House of Representatives waiting to get listed for debate and discussion. And, I would hope that would happen sooner rather than later. I did contact Parliament House last week to ask them about that, but there was no information about the timeline about when those changes would be considered by the Parliament.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for your presentation today, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. A special thank you for the people that have submitted questions, and if there are any questions that were missed out today, please remember to contact Jennifer via email. Finally, I'd like to mention that we will have another webinar in December, so stay tuned. The best way about to keep informed about our upcoming webinars is to ensure that you subscribe to our newsletter or visit our website under the Workers and Professionals portal. I'm also very excited to announce that in November, in line with the International Day of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, 1-800-RESPECT will launch a Frontline Workers Toolkit. And to access or to get any more information about accessing this toolkit, please ensure also that you subscribe to our newsletter, or you can go to 1800respect.org.au/toolkit. Finally now, please stay on the line, because if you stay logged in, we'd like you to take our online survey, which will be redirected to you now. And finally, thanks again. Thank you for your participation, your questions and your feedback, and we wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And remember, I'm really happy to continue to answer any questions over the email. If you want to send anything in, jennifer.byrne@uts.edu.au.